August 22nd, 1485. Bosworth Field, Central England, and the last Plantagenet king in all of English history, Richard III, lay dead in the mud, with his crown rolling through the trampled grass. The man who picked up that crown was not a warrior king with centuries of unbroken royal blood behind him, was not even someone most English lords had ever met. He was Henry Tudor, a Welsh exile who had spent the majority of his adult life hiding on the European continent, who had fewer than 2,000 soldiers when the battle started, and who won the English throne not through overwhelming military strength, but through a single devastating act of betrayal by a powerful noble family that switched sides at exactly the right moment when the outcome was still genuinely uncertain. This is where the Tudor dynasty began. Not with grandeur, not with inevitability, not with the kind of sweeping historical momentum that makes dynasties feel permanent in retrospect. It began with a coin toss that happened to land the right way up, in a field covered in August heat and dead men, when everything about the logic of the situation suggested the outcome should have been completely different. Henry VII understood something that very few kings in English history ever fully grasped, which was that winning a throne and keeping a throne were two completely separate problems, and the second one was infinitely harder and more expensive and more exhausting than the first. Within 3 years of Bosworth, two entirely different men had already appeared claiming to be the rightful King of England. Lambert Simnel, a 10-year-old boy presented as the Earl of Warwick, crowned in Ireland with actual foreign military backing and an army that marched into England in 1487 and came closer to toppling the new dynasty than most popular history books admit. And then Perkin Warbeck, a far more dangerous impostor who convinced the King of France, the Holy Roman Emperor, and the King of Scotland to support him simultaneously, spending nearly a decade attempting to take Henry's throne before his final capture in 1499. Was Henry paranoid? Absolutely. Was that paranoia justified? 2 pretenders, 3 foreign monarchs, and at least 6 discovered conspiracies in 15 years. Of rule suggests the answer is yes, obviously, and anyone who thinks otherwise is not reading the same historical record. And then came the son, Henry VIII, who was everything his father was not. Physically enormous, politically charismatic, terrifyingly certain of his own judgment on every subject from theology to military strategy, and constitutionally incapable of accepting the word no from any human being, including the Pope in Rome. When Pope Clement VII refused to annul Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon in 1533, Henry did not submit, did not quietly accept the theological authority of the most powerful religious institution in the Western world, did not find a compromise that preserved the basic structures of European Christendom. He dissolved the connection entirely. He declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England, seized every monastery in the country over the next 7 years in a program of state confiscation that transferred roughly 1/3 of English land ownership in less than a decade, and executed the Lord Chancellor Thomas More, who was one of the most respected intellectuals in Europe, simply for refusing to publicly endorse the decision. What Henry created was not just a religious reformation. It was a permanent, structural division in English society that would generate conspiracies, rebellions, civil conflicts, and assassination attempts for the next 150 years. Here is the number that explains everything about the Middle Tudor period. 6 wives in 38 years of marriage. 2 marriages annulled, 2 wives executed. 1 died shortly after childbirth. 1 outlived him. And beneath every single one of those marriages was the same terrifying question that had haunted the dynasty since the day Henry VII walked off Bosworth Field. Who inherits the throne, and what happens to England if the answer is wrong? Consider what this looked like from the perspective of the English nobility watching from their country estates in the 1540s. Imagine running a major business enterprise where the ownership rules changed completely every 4 to 6 years, where the primary product the business was supposed to deliver kept either not appearing or dying in infancy, and where your personal survival depended on correctly predicting who would hold power 3 successions from the current moment. Thomas Cromwell, the man who had helped Henry demolish the Catholic Church in England, and built the administrative machinery of the early modern English state virtually from nothing, was executed in 1540 not for treason in any conventional military or political sense, but because he arranged the wrong marriage and Henry found Anne of Cleves unattractive. That was the level of risk involved in serving the Tudors. Henry VIII died in January 1547, and what he left behind was a 9-year-old boy on the throne of England, a country that had just ripped itself away from the Catholic Church and had not yet decided what Protestant theology it actually believed in, and a council of regents who were already maneuvering against each other before the royal funeral was properly concluded. Edward VI was, by every surviving account, extraordinarily intelligent for his age. He read theology with the seriousness of a trained scholar, held opinions about religious reform that were considerably more radical than anything his father had contemplated, and corresponded with leading Protestant thinkers on the continent who considered him a genuine intellectual peer. But Edward was also dying from complications that began almost at birth, and everyone in his government who had access to the medical reports knew it. His reign lasted 6 years. In those 6 years, his Regency Council executed 2 of its own senior members for treason against each other, dismantled the Mass throughout England, and produced 2 complete national prayer books for a church that had existed independently for fewer than 15 years. Was this reform? Was it the desperate overreach of men who knew their window was closing? The pace of those decisions looks less like confidence and more like panic when you understand the timeline. July 6, 1553. And Edward VI died at Greenwich Palace at 15 years old, still maneuvering in his final weeks to protect the Protestant succession he had devoted his short reign to building. What happened in the following 9 days is one of the most extraordinary miscalculations in English history. A 16-year-old girl named Jane Grey, who had been systematically manipulated by her own family and by the Duke of Northumberland into accepting a crown she repeatedly and explicitly said she did not want, became Queen of England for exactly 9 days before the entire country turned against the coup and declared for Mary Tudor instead. Here is what makes the Jane Grey story genuinely devastating rather than merely tragic. She had done absolutely nothing wrong. She had been placed on a throne against her documented objections by powerful men who needed a Protestant figurehead to protect their own accumulated wealth and positions. And the moment the gamble failed, those same men immediately declared their loyalty to Mary and left a 16-year-old girl to be executed in the Tower of London. The Tudor dynasty survived the crisis. Jane Grey did not. Mary I was the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, the woman Henry VIII had divorced to trigger the entire catastrophe of the English Reformation, and she had spent 20 years watching her mother publicly humiliated, her own legal legitimacy stripped away by Act of Parliament, and her Catholic faith declared illegal in the country she would one day rule. When she became queen in 1553, the reversal was total and it was violent. In 5 years, Mary had approximately 300 Protestants burned at the stake, bishops and ordinary tradespeople, and a 17-year-old apprentice and an 80-year-old woman, earning her the historical epithet, Bloody Mary, which she would have considered profoundly unjust because from her theological framework she was engaged in a work of mercy, saving corrupted souls from heresy. But what do the actual numbers tell us? Philip II of Spain, whom Mary married in 1554, and who was at that precise moment the most powerful monarch on earth, commanding an empire that stretched from Spain to the Americas to half of Italy. Even he could not give Mary the one thing the dynasty required above everything else: 2 phantom pregnancies, no children born. And when Mary died in November 1558, every Catholic restoration she had imposed simply died alongside her, because there was no heir to sustain it. And then came Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, the woman Henry VIII had accused of adultery and treason, and beheaded in 1536 when Elizabeth was not yet 3 years old, the woman whose daughter had been declared illegitimate before she was old enough to understand what illegitimate meant, and who had spent her entire childhood and adolescence not knowing from one month to the next whether her father's mood would result in her execution. Elizabeth I became queen at 25 years old, And what she understood better than any other Tudor monarch was that survival required patience, deliberate ambiguity, and the absolute refusal to give enemies anything solid enough to be used as a target. She spent the first 15 years of her reign refusing to name a successor specifically because she grasped that a name, the successor, was not a reassurance. It was an alternative to a living monarch, and in 16th century English politics, an alternative was an invitation. Was this wisdom? Was it a deeply irresponsible gamble with the stability of an entire nation? 3 centuries of serious historians have argued the question and reached no consensus, which probably means the truth is somewhere in the complicated middle. The scale of organized conspiracy against Elizabeth I is something that English national history has never quite fully absorbed. There were at least 4 major documented plots to assassinate or depose her between 1569 and 1586. The Ridolfi plot of 1571, which involved the Duke of Norfolk, the King of Spain, and an Italian banker named Roberto Ridolfi, who was so indiscreet about his plans that he functioned as an unwitting intelligence asset for Elizabeth's spy master William Cecil. The Throckmorton plot of 1583, which again involved planned Spanish military intervention on English soil. The Babington plot of 1586, which was so thoroughly infiltrated by Francis Walsingham's intelligence network that serious historians still debate whether Walsingham deliberately allowed it to develop past the point of no return specifically to manufacture grounds for executing Mary Queen of Scots. Every single one of these plots had foreign state backing. Everyone had domestic support from English Catholics, who believed Elizabeth was a heretic occupying a throne she had no legitimate right to hold. Everyone failed. But none of them failed through luck. They failed because Walsingham built and operated a surveillance apparatus with the systematic intensity of a man who genuinely believed that failure meant the end of Protestant England, and he was probably right about that. Mary Queen of Scots had been a prisoner in England for 19 years when Elizabeth finally signed her death warrant in February 1587. And in those 19 years she had generated more political instability from inside an English castle than most free monarchs could have produced from their own thrones with their own armies. Because Mary did not need to act directly, she only needed to exist. Every Catholic government in Europe that wanted to remove Elizabeth from power had a ready-made, theoretically legitimate alternative sitting in Fotheringhay Castle, corresponding with conspirators through coded messages hidden in beer barrels, endorsing assassination plots against the woman providing her room and board, offering herself as a figurehead for anyone who required one. When Elizabeth F. Inally signed the warrant and Mary was executed in February 1587, the diplomatic fallout was enormous. Philip II of Spain cited it as partial justification for launching the Spanish Armada the following year. But what was the alternative? A living Mary Queen of Scots was a permanent, open invitation for every enemy England possessed to attempt the same thing again next year, and the year after that, indefinitely, until one of the attempts succeeded. May 1588, and the most powerful naval force assembled in European history was preparing to sail from Lisbon Harbor toward the English Channel. 130 ships, 27,000 soldiers and sailors. The explicit stated mission was to land a Spanish army in England, depose Elizabeth Tudor, restore Catholicism, and permanently end a dynasty that had been antagonizing Catholic Europe for 50 years. Philip II had been planning and financing this enterprise for 3 years. Pope Sixtus V had promised financial support upon successful landing, and England's total dedicated naval strength at that moment was approximately 34 warships. Think very carefully about what those proportions actually mean. Imagine your country has 34 defensive units, and the attacking force has 130 military vessels backed by the wealthiest imperial economy in the world, with papal blessing and the explicit goal of regime change. The odds were not merely unfavorable, they were historically absurd. And yet the Armada failed, through a combination of English tactical innovation pioneered by commanders like Francis Drake, catastrophic Spanish logistical overconfidence about supply lines and communication, and a sequence of violent North Sea storms that scattered the fleet beyond recovery. The commemorative medal Elizabeth struck afterward read simply, "God blew and they were scattered." The dynasty survived again, February 8, 1601, and Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, who had been Elizabeth's most favored courtier for 15 years, and whom she had indulged and forgiven with a patience that historians have struggled to explain rationally, rode through the streets of London with 200 armed followers, expecting the citizens to rise up and support his rebellion against the ministers he blamed for the destruction of his career. Nobody rose. The streets were empty. Essex rode back to his own house, surrendered within hours, and was executed on Tower Hill 3 weeks later. What this final Tudor crisis revealed was something genuinely significant: that by 1601, after 43 consecutive years of Elizabeth's reign, the political and administrative structures of England were stable and deeply enough embedded that a rebellion by one of the most publicly celebrated noblemen in the country could simply collapse without producing a wider dynastic emergency. The machinery held. The dynasty had over 118 years of pretenders and papal excommunications and burned heretics and executed ministers and failed armadas, built something durable enough to survive even the catastrophic recklessness of its own most privileged supporters. Elizabeth I died on March 24, 1603, at 69 years old, having never married, having never named a successor publicly until the final hours of her life, having spent the better part of 50 years as the living embodiment of a dynasty that had started with a stolen crown in a muddy field and survived everything that 6 European monarchies, 3 papal administrations, and dozens of domestic conspirators had thrown at it for over a century. She left no children. The Tudor line ended with her death. James VI of Scotland became James I of England. The Stuart dynasty began its own complicated and ultimately catastrophic reign, and within 46 years the English had tried and executed a Stuart king in front of his own palace in public, before a watching crowd. The Tudors, for all the violence and the paranoia and the 6 wives and the 300 burned at the stake, and the ministers executed for arranging unattractive marriages, had managed something that their successors never quite achieved. They had built a state that felt, to most people living inside it most of the time, like a structure that was genuinely holding together.